Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Canada and the fact that racism against Asian Canadians and those of Asian descent is increasing in that country, of course, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, global, of course, COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen, of course, in many places around the world, racism towards Asians of all sorts, be they Chinese or otherwise. And just as if on cue, there's been a poll conducted by the Chinese Canadian National Council, for Social Justice, which says that 1 in 5 Canadians think it's not safe to even sit beside an Asian person on the bus, especially if they're not wearing a mask. Just over the past 24 hours or so, there's also been graffiti and vandalism at Vancouver's Chinese Cultural Centre. And of course, the mayor in Vancouver has condemned that and spoken out against that, as have other officials across Canada at this time. But nevertheless, it is a worrying sign that this sort of incidents increase, especially in a country which prides itself so much on multiculturalism. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Professor Kerry Bowman, who is a bioethicist. He teaches ethics and global health at the University of Toronto. He's joining us now this morning from Toronto. Joining us as well from Canada is Zain Velji, who is a partner at North Weather. He has managed campaigns for candidates in Canada, including the Calgary Mayor, Naheed Nenshi, who is North America's first Muslim mayor. He's joining us now from Calgary. Zain and Kerry, thank you both for your time this morning. Kerry, let me start with you. What do you make of the racism that Asian Canadians are experiencing at this point in time? As I said in my introduction, I've grown up in Toronto as well, and you see a lot of people of Asian descent. I mean, it's hard to imagine that we see ourselves as separate from them as Canadians.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it is profoundly disturbing to me as a Canadian and as a citizen of anywhere in the world to see this kind of behavior. As you clearly said in your intro, I mean, Canada is a highly culturally diverse society. And remember, this is an immigrant nation, right? This is very different than a European society, for example. Immigration is really the foundation of Canada altogether. And so, you know, in that way, it's much a newer Western culture in a sense. So it's very disturbing to see this. You know, the pressure of the, and I'm not making excuses, believe me, but as the pandemic continues, likely the pressure, and also, you know, the international, is China to blame? Are they not to blame? All this could be feeding into this as well.
Indeed. So, Zain, how much of that do you play into this, especially across the border when we're talking about the United States, where we've had the president, at least in the past, refer to this virus as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus? Does that feed into then the sort of racism within Canada as well?
Of course it does. I mean, it accelerates the fear. It perpetuates the fear. That's what we're facing right now. At the end of the day, you know, Kerry mentioned very astutely that Canada is a nation of immigrants. Not only that, but Canada has been a nation that has accepted this policy of multiculturalism and embedded it within the core philosophy of this country, right? Canada's core philosophy around migration is not that you're just welcome here, but you're welcome with the multiple identities, the pluralistic identities that you wear, your religion, your culture. You don't have to assimilate here. That's the point, is that you can be who you are. You can be part of your overall sort of tradition and still be as Canadian as anyone else. Everyone's a Canadian in that sense. And I think what something like this does is it takes the rhetoric from the United States, that far-right rhetoric that's calling it the Wuhan virus, that's trying to pin it on the Chinese, and it's then perpetuating and accelerating an already, you know, divisive and problematic issue we've had in this country, which is racism against East Asians. This is not something new. This coronavirus has accelerated it, especially in cities like Vancouver, where you have 1/5 of the population or even more being from the descent of Asian background. So this just accelerates what's already been happening in the fabric of Canadian society and really challenges some of those multicultural ethos that we've already put on the table.
Indeed, Kerry, that's a good point, isn't it? Because, you know, as I was doing research for this and as I've experienced as well, this sort of racism is not new. What do you put that down to? Why are these feelings sort of underlying even you know, in a pre-COVID-19 era?
With Canada, it is all the good things it says to be, but, you know, historically it's a colony. It was originally white, Anglo-Saxon, and British ancestry. And, there's elements in this social fabric, as there is with all colonial structures, that are very problematic. And, mostly Canada has transcended those things. But if you look historically at views of Asian society as disease carriers, these concepts were perpetuated throughout a lot of the Western world and the colonies. So, a big problem there. The strength is most of our leaders, the vast majority of our leadership, is denouncing this very strongly. That's profoundly different than what's going on in the United States, where these things are being fed. And, every country in the world is heavily influenced by the United States, but nowhere on the level of Canada. I mean, our borders with the United States, there's massive geographical and cultural similarities in some ways. And what's going on south of the border is a huge influence on this. Also, the core of what led to this virus, because it appears to have emerged from Wuhan, there's blame being put. But, these animal-based viruses, I don't want to change subjects here, but they can emerge anywhere in this world. Ebola is an example. And so there's also a deeper targeting, to a sense, against Asians because of the origins of this virus, which, again, could have come from anywhere.
It's interesting, isn't it? This is happening while we have a Prime Minister of Canada who is very pro-immigration. I mean, Trudeau has been, at least on the face of it, very welcoming to immigrants and has spoken about increasing, in fact, immigrant quotas throughout his tenure so far. That's sort of this paradoxical then existence, right, where we have, as Kerry there also said, a whole bunch of officials pretty much across the spectrum really coming out against the sort of racism, but at the same time, it's still very much happening as those officials are condemning it. I mean, how does that really work in your mind?
No, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things I'd say is one of Canada's dirty little secrets is that systemic racism also happens here. And that sounds like a very simple statement, but what I mean by that is that the global image of Canada is this sort of harmonious, consistently pluralistic, multicultural society where things that happened in the United States, where a bigoted, zealot sort of right-wing populist government could rise, could never happen here. And the truth of the matter is, it totally can. And we have the same base of systemic sort of racism that's existed in our country, and arguably with the way we've treated our Indigenous people over the centuries here in Canada, which I know you're well aware of, having been here in Toronto as well, that Canada is not immune to this stuff. And Kerry brought up a good point. The porous boundary with the United States, especially culturally, when we get our news from there, when we borrow their political views, when the zeitgeist of what's happening there transfers through our porous borders, you inflame more and more and more of what I'd call this othering, which is, if your life isn't going well, you feel like you've lost a job, you feel like, these open borders are causing you to lose a sense of yourself and your identity. What do? You point a finger at the other. And what do you do more specifically? You point at the other who's successful, who's creating capacity, who's creating generational capacity with their families and a livelihood in this country. And that's what's happening here, is that Asian Canadians as a population have been here for decades, and in certain parts of the country for dozens, if not close to 100 years. This is now pointing fingers at a successful immigrant population and saying they're the ones who've taken my capacity and the opportunity that was so rightfully mine. And when you inflame that sort of perspective, it really kind of unearths the systemic racism and issues that we do have here that many countries do.
Indeed. Kerry, I don't want to justify, of course, this sort of thing, but do you think that within a situation as high stress as COVID-19, right? Because there's so many unknowns about this virus that the stress is really quite high in many people's minds, especially because, again, they don't know who would possibly have it, who is possibly just asymptomatic and carrying it at this point in time. Within that stressful situation, is it to be expected that there will be a level of hatred towards somebody? I mean, I imagine people would be looking for a scapegoat, wouldn't they?
No, that's exactly how human psychology works. And there's no question about that. And when you look at, just in the last day or two, and even in the last 12 hours, President Trump in the United States is really questioning, could this have been created in the lab? This is going to that theory has been floated a lot. There's zero evidence of that, by the way, as we all know, zero. But this fuels it, that there's some kind of a nasty plot going on. So it does fuel it. But I must say, and it's not out of patriotism that I say this, I've lived in different places, but, Canada is great. But under the pressure of this pandemic, Canada's largely fairly cohesive politically on this. We're not fighting with each other. Our provinces are not on everything, but mostly we're integrated and standing together on this. Canada's quite functional under this pressure. The United States is showing a lot of fractures. So I'm encouraged by that. And it's not just our leaders that need to speak out. I'm a university professor. I discuss this with my students all the time. We go right back to January when we were discussing this as the virus first emerged. And it's the response, and you don't have to be a university professor. It's something we all need to speak out on and have conversations about because it's so important.
Zen, to show how far this has gotten, we know now that Dr. Theresa Tam, who is the chief public health officer there in Canada, she's also being targeted, at this point in time because of her Asian descent as well. And of course, especially within the Trudeau cabinet, there are a number of ministers who are of different immigrant backgrounds. What does that say to you as well, that, that the sort of hatred is being directed even towards those high up, and especially somebody who's actually leading the fight within the country against COVID-19? And again, it seems sort of, it's counterproductive, doesn't it, to be targeting someone who's actually fighting the pandemic on behalf of the public?
Oh, absolutely, right. And this is a cause of two things in my mind politically. Number one, that there's a base of people who have these views harbored against East Asian Canadians and Asian Canadians broadly, and stoking those flames has a political benefit. You have someone, a conservative leadership candidate right now, stoking those flames, saying is Theresa Tam's loyalty to Canada or is it to China, which is an absolutely insane thing to say. But he's going to say it because there's a base of people that want to hear something like that on the fringes, right? To Kerry's point. And this politician who's running is also on the fringes himself. Secondly, however, I think what is dangerous and could kind of propel this sentiment even forward is the concept that, as different provinces in our country open up at different times, have different plans of opening up, you will see a certain restlessness from the population saying, why are we not opening up sooner? What's going on here? Is it because I live in an urban, dense city that has a lot of East Asian Canadians that I'm actually now not able to open up? You're going to see stuff like that enter the narrative, and you already are. It's not like I'm saying something that isn't existing, but you're going to see stuff like that accelerate, which could have a problem of enhancing this issue of this systemic racism even further. So I hope that does not happen, but I'm just kind of reading the tea leaves of where we go if we have different parts of our country opening up at different schedules, and there's a fear of missing out when you're already restless about your own economic and social prospects going forward.
Exactly. And just as a final comment, then I wanted to speak about the economic impact of all of this, right? Because we did know, especially in cities like I believe it was Toronto and other places where within Chinatown restaurants were empty, even in the early days really of COVID-19 and the outbreak there in Canada. Do you think that there will be an economic impact on this specific community, i.e. those of East Asian descent?
I don't think it'll be long lasting. And we saw this in the early days. Now, remember, we had SARS. SARS occurred in Asia, and the only place outside of Asia was Toronto. I was, a Toronto healthcare worker during SARS. I was quarantined. I've been down this road before. And there really was at that point, because remember, SARS did emerge from the Far East as well, there was a lot of, Asian restaurants, Asian facilities were not used at all. There was a pretty quick bounce back with that. But I'm going to agree. I think I don't want to be negative here. I think our toughest days as we move towards cautious integration, it's not going to be easy. We as Canadians and the whole world, we have to start taking on some risks. We've been tucked in our houses for a while. And we have to learn to live together under difficult circumstances because the virus is not gone. And I'm only hoping that goes well, but it could exacerbate more tension. We have to be vigilant on this.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate both Kerry and Zen for their time this morning. Kerry, they're speaking to us from Toronto, and Zen speaking to us this morning from Calgary. We appreciate their insight, of course. Viewers, as we've spoken of course, a lot of this racism we're seeing playing out specifically within Canada or even other places around the world is not new, especially towards those of East Asian descent. A lot of these feelings have existed just under the surface sometimes and within systems, but now is coming to the fore again within this situation, as I put to Kerry, of high stress and where people are looking for scapegoats at this point in time. Unfortunately, that is just how human psychology works. We look for somebody to blame. And then, of course, we're having these geopolitical arguments as well about who on a world scale is to blame for that. Is China to blame? According to the U.S., yes, the U.S. president more specifically, even though his own intelligence agency says, no, this was not started in a lab. But Trump is convinced that this did start in a lab. All of that sort of rhetoric does play out, especially in a country like Canada, which is so close to the U.S. with such a porous borders, as both of our guests there mentioned. So there's this unfortunate negative effect, especially on a country which, again, both of our guests also underlined, is one that prides itself on multiculturalism, having people of different ethnicities living side by side on a daily basis. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss an Iranian scientist in the U.S. Who's still in a U.S. immigration jail being held by ICE. And he has now, unfortunately, contracted coronavirus as well. Dr. Sirus Asghari is a materials science and engineering professor who then spoke out in March of this year itself about the unsanitary and inhumane conditions that he was placed in within detention. This all goes back to 2017 when he was charged with fraud and trade secret theft relating to his work with the university in Ohio. He was acquitted in that case. And this is a man who has major ties to the U.S. too, by the way, as in he has children who live in the U.S. and work in the U.S. And he himself, of course, had a valid visa at the time. That visa has been revoked, and that basically since 2019 onwards, he's been kept in this ICE detention, and he's been pleading to be released, but that is not occurring. This is certainly something that is of concern, of course, on many levels, but it seems that he is a victim of this ongoing tensions between the U.S. and Iran as well, quite likely. Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Reza Khanzadeh, who is a research fellow at the Sharif University think tank, which is based in Tehran. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. this morning. Reza, good morning to you. What do you make of this case? I mean, the more one reads about it, the more disturbing it is. What justification do you see, if any, to continue to hold this man in prison?
Yeah, I don't see any justification really, other than the fact if we were to put ourselves perhaps in the place of ICE and the position that they're in, historically, if we've seen the way ICE has handled their detainees, it's always been very poor conditions, very, very inhumane conditions. And this is not an isolated incident with this one individual. If we look at thousands upon thousands of Central American, migrants and detainees, at ICE, they've experienced sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse by these, ICE agents. Even the ACLU came out with a report from 2009 and 2014 that, ICE agents have, performed these types of abuses. So, there is no justification. But once again, if we were to put the shoe on the other foot, so to speak, with the virus and having these types of restrictions as far as travel, I could see why perhaps they are detaining him, because right now he is in the Wynn location. And I think the last time I checked the ICE website, they have about 490 confirmed cases, but at the Wynn location, there's 7. So he's included in that 7, and he is in isolation. So it's as if they're taking their own steps, their own measures to kind of self-quarantine or self-isolate these. I mean, they call them detainees, but I'd rather call them prisoners the way they've been treated. And yeah, I feel like they kind of run by their own rules, if you will. And this is a microcosm of what the U.S. government has had problems with for decades upon decades. Is this type of self-governance, if you will, when it comes to ICE.
Reza, do you think at some level that Dr. Askari has become a victim of just this U.S.-Iran tensions as well, right? Because the Americans possibly could argue, and Western countries could argue, that there are a couple of political prisoners within Iran as well, who are dual nationals of whatever respective Western country, be it European, America, Canada, or whatever. Do you think that he's sort of fallen victim to that whole dynamic?
Yeah, I've done some research on that, and I have followed that in the past couple of years. And my fellow Iran analysts in the Washington D.C. area might make that argument, but I would steer clear of that, primarily because historically, yes, we've seen that this type of U.S.-Iran relationship, or the back and forth that they have, that tension that they have, involves these types of prisoner swaps and detaining a foreign national on some, bogus charges. But ever since Trump has come into office, it's more of this, bombastic rhetoric where it's more about going to war rather than, doing these types of prisoner swaps, if you will. So no, I don't really see it as some type of, foreign policy, political, type of, angle. I think it more has to do with the dysfunction of the U.S. government and just how they handle their detainees at the ICE locations, if you will. Because like I said, this is a long history of problems that ICE has encountered, and there's been vast number of human rights organizations pleading that this needs to be taken care of. And actually most recently, a federal court in Miami, I believe, has a lawsuit against ICE and the U.S. Attorney General because of the kind of conditions that are going on within the Florida, types of detainee centers for ICE. But this one individual, Dr. Askari, he's in Louisiana. So, but I think it's more about just the dysfunction of the U.S. government rather than.
Okay, so Reza, as a final thought, then just before we go, I totally get your point about the goal here, or the intention here, may not have been political in nature, and probably does go down to the ICE dysfunctionality, as you quite correctly laid out. But do you think then the result of this could nevertheless become political? Because as you well know, I'm sure you've been following this in Persian language media, especially within Iran, as well as even English language media within Iran. This has been playing out. This is almost front page news at this point, because this is obviously an Iranian citizen who is being mistreated in Iranians' eyes, at least at this point in time. This will play out, do you think, geopolitically?
I feel time will tell. I'm still cautious because there is two individuals being detained in Iran right now. Their last names are Namazi, and I think it's been hundreds, if not, hundreds upon hundreds of days that they've been detained, and they've kind of fell out of the, global conversation or the, media conversation. So I feel like this might, follow the same suit. And no, honestly, I don't believe it will. And that kind of goes back with Trump and his approach, or, maybe his approach with Iran, having that type of rhetoric where, it seems like they're always on the brink of war with Iran. So unfortunately, no, I don't feel like him being detained will, kind of escalate or, get to a higher level of, debate or,
All right, very well. Let's leave that as a thought then, Reza. But of course, we appreciate you getting up this early for us there in D.C. and giving us your thoughts, of course, on this disturbing case. As I said, viewers, Dr. Askari still in detention, even though he'd been pleading even before, mind you, he had contracted COVID-19. Since 2017, he's had this case in which he's been exonerated. So for any citizen of any country to then be held in ICE detention, even though he or she has been acquitted in whatever case has been put forth against them. Does that really make sense? Does it go back to, as Reza there said, just ICE dysfunctionality? Because it's not like it's just Dr. Askari in ICE detention. There's countless of Central Americans who are also being sexually abused right as we speak, probably, and being mistreated in some fashion or the other. So Dr. Askari has unfortunately got caught up within all of that. But then on the other side, of course, there is the argument to be made that there are political tensions between the U.S. and Iran. That's just a fact of life. Can this or can this not play out politically in that regard? Because at this point in time, at least, as we're speaking, the Iranian media is picking up on this story and is running with it. And it is, of course, of importance, I would imagine, to the Iranian government, as well as it should be for the American government as well, considering this is a citizen of a perceived adversarial country as well. I'll be back with my last segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In today's final segment, we're going to discuss the United States once again. We're going to talk about the unemployment benefits that have been handed out and are being handed out as we speak to those who have been furloughed, laid off, etc., because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Credit to the U.S. government for acting in that regard. But one of the interesting dynamics that has now come up is that for some of those people, especially those on minimum wage, it seems that those unemployment benefits, once added up across the board, can sometimes work out to be more than what they were actually earning on a regular basis. And that's then brought up two sides of this argument, right? On one side, it's the people saying that, okay, possibly we're just giving too much to these people at this point in time. They don't need that sort of compensation. And on the other side, then we have a number of lawmakers as well saying, okay, maybe we need to now revisit minimum wages and the wages that we're paying these people. Maybe we need to give them more, in fact, for the work that they are doing at this point in time. So I'm going to put that to our guests who are joining us now this morning from Washington, D.C. Is joining us Jim Williams, who's a 7-time Emmy Award-winning journalist with the Washington Bureau Chief for LJC Media and Genesis Communications. We're also joined by Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. Michael and Jim, good morning to you both. Michael, what do you make of this? Because this is an interesting dynamic, isn't it, where if the compensation for the work that was once done and is now suspended is more than what was being paid for while the person was working itself, does that mean the U.S. should possibly look into increasing the minimum wage?
Well, good afternoon. It's good to be with you. Thank you once again for inviting me. I don't think, no, that this is a very temporary, discrete situation that we find ourselves in. And I don't think that we ought to be making our macroeconomic policy based on a window of opportunity or misopportunity for various people, depending on which side of the pay ledger they're on. This was flagged in the beginning. We knew that the unemployment scheme that had been come up with by Congress was going to be more generous than many Americans were making at their jobs. But you have to look at the overall aggregate numbers that we're using here. First of all, I believe the literature that I've read on this means that many Americans through unemployment are eligible with the bonuses and things like that for upwards towards $1,000 a week. Now, in our economy, $1,000 a week is a very, very generous salary. And, it sort of makes one wonder, scratch their head a little bit, why we came up with that number to compensate people who had lost their jobs because of the virus pandemic. But nonetheless, that's what we came up with. I believe it's in the high 900s. Well, that's $50,000 a year. $50,000 a year is an excellent wage in the United States. And there's really, there's no reason why the government should mandate that as a permanent wage, just because we have a window of 3 months here where people are going to be making it. We have a general philosophy here in America that labor is a commodity to be bartered and sold on the open market. And so the minimum wage, although it is set at $7.25 an hour, almost nobody makes $7.25 an hour. Because employers can't find people to work for that because they're not willing to barter their wage, their labor on the open market for $7.25. So most people make more than that. So I think we're in a very short, discrete window. Some people will make out, some people will lose. But the important thing is that Americans and around the world, that people get back to work and we get the economy in the world going again.
Jim, what are your thoughts on that? Because as you know, a number of lawmakers, as I said, I think AOC has already come out in this regard, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and I believe a few others have also said maybe it is time to revisit minimum wages because many of these people who are working within the industries that they're probably working in are probably working more than one job as well. Do you think that that should be revisited, that this needs to be redesigned in some way?
Well, I think it is being revisited. I mean, if you look at the different states and how the different governors in those states work, they're all pushing in the predominantly blue states or Democratic states, they're pushing for a higher minimum wage. President Trump and the Republican Party tend to want to keep that down. You know, one of the highest voices, or loudest voices, I should say, against this is a gentleman by the name of Senator Rick Scott, who used to be the governor of Florida. He had the lowest benefits for unemployment at the time. They were like $240, I think, for 12 weeks. So I believe that, yes, there's an argument about that. Now, to get back to Michael's point, I agree with him that this is a short-term fix because we've never come up against something like this, and people need to be able to pay their mortgages and need to be able to live. So a living wage during this pandemic makes sense. I do believe it's a short-term fix. I don't believe that, for instance, Rick Scott's theory that people would prefer not to work and get a government paycheck is really, it's a false narrative.
All right, so let's talk about living wage, Michael, because as I put to Jim, a lot of these people are working within the industries they're working in, respectively. And if we're talking about the more expensive cities like New York, possibly, a lot of them are possibly working more than one job, right? And things are tight for them. Have to keep their belt tight at all times. Do you think that there should be an argument made overall about possibly looking into, again, the wages that these people are paid, how they're treated vis-a-vis health insurance, et cetera?
Well, I actually agree wholeheartedly with what I think was one of the points that Jim made in the beginning of his comment, which came through loud and clear to me. And that is that we've evolved in the United States here to a point where we're recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, that the federal government may not be the appropriate place for a minimum wage to be dictated to the economy. I told you that the generic feeling in the United States is that the value or worth of labor can be established by the market. And if someone has a job and you have labor to do that job, then you get together and you negotiate what both of you are willing to work, and hence you've created a job and a salary for a worker. But the way we've evolved in recent years, really over the last 5 or maybe even more than that, is where each of the states is taking the lead now. And instead of relying on the federal government to set a national record, then states, high-wage states like New York, like California, localities like Seattle, like New York City, things like that, can establish their own minimum wages, which would be substantially above whatever the federal government has been setting. In fact, the federal government, under this circumstance, would have license to get out of setting the minimum wage. And so therefore, we wouldn't have one but a patchwork of minimum wages around, depending on what the cost of living is in that particular area. It would seem to make a lot more sense because $15 an hour does make more sense in an area like New York City or Seattle, and it makes absolutely no sense in Butte, Montana, or Jackson, Mississippi, where the cost of living is substantially lower than it is in these high-cost areas.
Okay. Jim, one of the things that's come up during COVID-19 overall has been how we've defined essential workers, right? So we're talking about just the most basic of workers, janitors, cleaners, et cetera, even delivery boys / girls. And do you think that within the U.S. as well, there is now this understanding that a lot of those people that we saw at the lower end of the pyramid are actually those who are quite vital and important to keep an economy and a society going even during a pandemic?
Well, absolutely. I think that what we're seeing is that it's a supply chain, right? It's got to start with the first cog in the wheel. And we're finding out and watching that the economy is basically a consumer-driven economy. We are when we buy products, no matter whether it comes from Amazon and they deliver it to your home and you go through the warehouse, or you go out and buy it, it's an economy that rests on whether or not people are buying something. And I think we find out now during the pandemic that by all means, we have a delivery service for groceries because, it's something that we do not want to go out and socially begin and take those chances. That service provides us a fantastic service. We pay them for that service. So yes, it's absolutely taking a look and showing that everybody in this wheel has a job that is very important. And yes, we're reevaluating what quote unquote essential means.
All right, so Michael, what are your thoughts? Because if I may just use the example of Amazon, as Jim brought that up, you know that there have been concerns at Amazon warehouses, right, about how workers are treated. And this is even from pre-COVID-19 times as well. And there have been a number of cases of, or at least alleged cases of how people have been treated there, i.e. not even allowed washroom breaks, et cetera. And that's possibly because of the load that Amazon has upon itself. Nevertheless, so there are issues, aren't there, with how workers are treated behind the scenes, possibly, in some of these factories?
Yes, I think Amazon is a very interesting study. So I'll mention that first. Amazon tends to pay very, very good wages for relatively unskilled labor. People want to work for Amazon. People compete for Amazon jobs. When Amazon, and I'm not talking about their headquarters jobs that pay an absolute fortune vis-a-vis our economy, but their warehouse jobs are all $15 an hour or more. The complaints generally come in about their working conditions, and you pointed out one where they get only a limited number of bathroom breaks, and if it doesn't coincide with their timetable, then you're out of luck. That's sort of an inhumane kind of thing to have going, I think. But nonetheless, Amazon has found that it works for them. It's between them and their workforce to figure out those details. And if the workers don't like the way those details are figured out, they have the right under U.S. law to unionize and negotiate on behalf of, collectively bargain on behalf of all the workers to make that come together. But again, that's something that in order to staff up and make the distribution and delivery system of Amazon work, they've had to pay above the market wage to attract the best people to make that happen. I think that throughout the entire American economy, we are seeing a general increase in wages. It's really only the bottom of the completely unskilled labor market where people are working for something close to minimum wage. And the statistics that I've seen are that people, if they demonstrate that they can do their job, unskilled it is, and if they show up to work on time every day and put in their full shift, they are promoted and raised above the minimum wage fairly shortly in the 6 to 9 month time frame. So the market appears to mostly be working, and we'll see what the future brings.
All right, so Jim, I'll give you the final word. Let's talk about the market itself then. Do you think that the market will work going forward once we're in this post-COVID-19 era? Will these sorts of workers be treated well going forward? Because, if we're all realizing right now that within this interim period, they're being paid probably more than what they usually make, do you think questions will be asked the other way around about whether or not they're being paid too much?
I don't think that they're going to be asked about whether they're being paid too much. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a very slow recovery to get back, because we're at a point now where social distancing is important. So let's say you open your restaurant or your store or whatever, you're going to open to anywhere between 25 and 45% capacity. So getting people back into the workforce is going to be a slow process. And then, let's say they reopen, but something flares up and they have to close down again. So I think we're right in kind of a quasi, we don't know what's going to happen phase, at least for the next 6 to 8 months, perhaps even a year. So we have to take this one step at a time. And I think that the higher minimum wage debate will go on all the way and become, no doubt, a major issue in the 2020 presidential race, and we'll see how it goes. But I think it's very difficult to predict at this moment, given that we are kind of slow rolling ourselves back into the economy, that, to crystal ball that is way above my pay grade, I can tell you that.
All right, well, we'll leave there at that. And of course, appreciate both Jan and Michael for their time today, this morning, and of course, for putting this all into context for us. It does strike one as odd, as I said, that the compensation being given to a lot of these workers is more than what they're usually paid, in fact, through their minimum wage and otherwise, especially for their respective work. But as both of our guests have said, this is just a temporary situation right now. Nevertheless, the likes of AOC, as I said, and other lawmakers are slowly bringing up now the issue of, okay, if we felt the need to give them more money during this interim period, does that mean they should be getting more money overall anyhow? Because for some of them at least, especially those living in very expensive cities or states like California and New York, they possibly do need more compensation for the work they're doing, especially considering some of them don't even get healthcare benefits, or not proper healthcare benefits at least, for the kind of work that they do. So these are certainly issues that both, as our guest there said, will continue to come up. Especially once we're in a post-COVID-19 era and the workforce slowly comes back into play, as Jim there had mentioned. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.